Good afternoon. Welcome to the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, IAIS Malaysia Forum on the Go, FTG. My name is Wan Naim, Deputy Head of Research and Research Fellow at IAIS. Today, we will explore how Qatar is navigating the Iran-US-Israel war and what its response reveals about the future of the larger Gulf security and regional stability. Joining us is Mr. Rasyid al-Mohanadi, Vice President of the Center for International Policy Research, CIPR, based in Doha, a leading government think tank focused on security, political risk, and conflict resolution in the Gulf. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, with expertise spanning small state security, defense policy, and geopolitical risk. Prior to this, he worked across Qatar's LNG sector at the highest levels and later in the domestic defense industry, contributing to the development of national defense capabilities. Welcome, Mr. Rasyid al-Mohanadi. Hope you are doing well. It was a pleasure meeting you earlier this year at our institute in Kuala Lumpur. And also please convey our warmest regard to Dr. Majid Al-Ansari, from Malaysia. So please, I think we should begin. Mr. Rasyid, let me begin with the fundamentals. Qatar has often been described as a small state with outsized influence. Today, that description is being tested in real time. This conflict has not remained contained. Iranian retaliation has struck across the Gulf, targeting states that host external military assets, including critical energy infrastructure, bringing the war to the doorsteps of countries that have sought to avoid direct involvement. Yet, despite being directly affected, Qatar's position has been especially clear and consistent, I believe. Senior officials from the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Sheikh Mohammed Al-Thani, to the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, which is CIPR's President, Dr. Majid Al-Ansari, have repeatedly stated that Qatar is not a party to this war and that it has distanced itself from the conflict from the outset, and it does not wish to be drawn into offensive operations against its neighbors. At the same time, Doha has emphasized that its priority is protecting its territory and population, while calling for an immediate halt to escalation and return to diplomacy. In many ways, this moment reinforces the key idea that strategic autonomy is not a luxury for small states, it is a necessity. So my question is, how has Qatar demonstrated the capacity to preserve strategic autonomy, national composure, and policy independence amid a conflict shaped by far larger powers and rapidly shifting regional dynamics?
So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me. It was an absolute pleasure visiting Malaysia earlier this year, and we're very happy with the cooperation between our two centers. First of all, let's look at this from a contextual point of view. So initially, Qatar and other Gulf actors like Oman and most of the Gulf have been pushing and advocating against this war. This has been done through the mediation efforts led by Oman and supported by Qatar. The Qatar brokered ceasefire between Israel, US, and Iran in 2025. So Qatar specifically and the Gulf generally have worked tirelessly to avoid this crisis. When the US and Israel eventually attacked Iran due to the failure of the negotiations, the assumption was that Iran might attack bases in the region related to US presence. What happened was, for us, a strategic shock. 65% of attacks were on civilian and non-military targets. So that's why the idea that this is a retaliation, I think, is factually wrong. This is not a retaliation, this is aggression. Iran has targeted Qatari sovereign bases, Qatari sovereign military facilities, civilian infrastructure. You know, they attacked Ras Laffan, the source of much of our prosperity and economic development. They've targeted civilian, locations. So it is a strategic shock for Qatar and the rest of the Gulf states. Just to give you some numbers, Qatar has been attacked by 200 plus ballistic missiles, more than 10 cruise missiles, hundreds of drones, and 2 Sukhoi 25 fighter jets. Alhamdulillah, Qatar has proven its might when it comes to defense. 96% of ballistic missiles were intercepted. All cruise missiles were intercepted. Most of the drones have been intercepted. And the 2 Sukhoi fighter planes were shot down in the sea by our Air Force. So it shows two dynamics. One is unfortunately failure of deterrence because the attacks happen, but it shows a success in defense. And it comes back to this concept that historically Gulf states were always criticized for overspending in defense. But looking at this, I think Gulf states proven that they were prepared for the worst. And that's why Qatar and Gulf states were able to blunt the majority of the attacks. Of course, if you keep defending, some attacks will go through. And unfortunately, they went through in our Ras Laffan LNG facilities where we lost 2 trains and 1 gas to liquid train in another facility. So it's a difficult situation for Gulf states. We are between a dual threat of Israeli overreach and Iranian aggression, in addition to the US being a little bit unpredictable, even though we have really good defense and security ties with the US. So it's a difficult situation, and I think post this conflict, we might see some grand revisions when it comes to Gulf strategies, especially when it comes to alliance management, hedging, balancing, but also a grand review on how we view countries like Iran, where historically we underestimated the level of potential threat. But unfortunately, during this war, it shows that we've at least politically underestimated the intent of doing harm. But alhamdulillah, because we have really good defense planners, we were able to plan for this potential aggression.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rasyid Mohanadi. I think before we go further, I would like to express our solidarity and also our support to the Qatari citizens of what has happened throughout the conflict. I think our countries, Malaysia and Qatar, has always had good relations and good cooperations, and especially also the cooperation between our think tanks. So our deepest solidarity and sympathy to what has happened. And thank you very much for explaining the data and especially the facts on the ground, and how it's very interesting that you mentioned that it is how the perspective is that is an aggression rather than a simple retaliation, especially due to the percentage of attacks on the general population and the infrastructure. Thank you for that. Definitely help us understand the matter better. So, Mr. Rasyid, if I can take a step further on Qatar's security model, we are now seeing a more complex phase of the conflict, one where military posturing is expanding beyond air and maritime domains. And recent developments, I think the latest one has shown that increased positioning of US forces across parts of the Gulf, raising the possibility that the conflict could evolve toward a more direct or even ground-based dimension. And I think the numbers that floating around is like around 20,000 ground troops has been stationed across the Gulf in preparation for a ground assault. And at the same time, as we can see, as you just mentioned, Gulf states have found themselves exposed to aggressions despite not seeking involvement in the conflict, especially I think Qatar more than ever for their position. But this brings us to a deeper structural question. Due to the presence of such exposure, should there be a rethinking of the security model? And does this conflict call for a rethinking of Doha, how Doha can best sustain stability, encourage restraint, and help shape a more balanced regional order? Simply, I mean, in brief, does the situation at hand make Qatar rethinks the whole security model? I think that would be a very interesting question.
Excellent. So let's unpack this. Let's look at Iranian strategy. Of course, looking at the US and the Israelis, they've started this war without consulting the Gulf allies. So can you hear me? It cut a little bit.
Yes.
Okay. So the US has conducted this operation with Israel without consulting Gulf allies. So that's one fact. Another fact is the Iranians planned for this. They planned that if the US and Israelis attack, they would attack almost all of their neighbors to cause as much economic pain as possible. Of course, for us, that was something, like I mentioned, it was a strategic shock. We assumed that Iran would be more restrained with dealing with its neighbors, especially that the neighbors worked very, very strongly to avoid this and offer off-ramps for the Iranians. So this was the Iranian strategy, and they thought that if they do this, then Gulf states will do two things. One is they will go and pressure the US to stop, and two, they would lower their defense partnerships with the US. This backfired. The Gulf states didn't go and beg the US to stop the attacks. Most Gulf states remained restrained, like Qatar and Oman and Saudi Arabia mostly. And my expectation that post this conflict, Gulf states would actually double down with their defense relationship with the US because of one fact. Because we had these defense ties with the US, we were able to blunt most of the attacks coming from Iran. We have US-made air defense systems, we have US-made fighters, and because we were able to build up this defense capacity alongside the US, we were able to blunt and stop most of the attacks and avoid, and I have to repeat this, avoid major casualty events, especially when the attacks targeted domestic locations like West Bay, like the place I am in. This part of Doha was targeted multiple times. So that's one angle. Another angle, which I think is interesting, is Gulf states would most likely revise their relationship with the European partners, because the position of Europe in this war has been extremely positive from a Gulf perspective. The UK, France, Germany, Italy, and other European partners provided Gulf with logistic support, defense support. The UK, for example, has a joint Typhoon squadron with Qatar. And so you can imagine Qatari and British pilots flying side by side, defending the skies of the Gulf. So from a Gulf perspective, the position from Europe has been very positive. So I would imagine in the upcoming regional security order and regional security architecture, we would see this Gulf-Europe nexus forming because of two big dynamics we're seeing. One is, and we have to look at it from this point of view, the great power competition between the US and China. This conflict has to be seen from this lens. For the Chinese, allowing the US to be bogged down in this region for even longer is a strategic win, because it takes US focus away from East Asia and from the South China Sea theater. But on the medium and long term, what's happening in the Gulf is a strategic loss. So it's a tactical win for China, but a strategic loss for China. The reason is China gets most of its oil and gas from this region, in addition to other products that we can go into, because people view the Strait of Hormuz as just an exit for oil and gas. But actually, the output of the Strait of Hormuz feeds into energy, fuel, electronics through helium exports, and fertilizer, most importantly, which affects food security. So coming back, that's one dynamic, which is the great power competition. Another dynamic, and they're interrelated, is US unpredictability. But in my point of view, it's very easy to explain US behavior now from a realist point of view. The US sees that China is its only potential peer competitor in the international system, and its policy decisions will be based on that. We see that in Venezuela when they implemented this operation and kidnapped Nicolas Maduro.
Yes.
And now they have very good relations with Venezuela, and they just opened their embassy. They're doing the same with Cuba. And what's happening with Iran has to be seen from this perspective. And I call this the strategy of, eliminating or changing Chinese friends. Venezuela used to sell very cheap oil to China. Now they have to sell to China in US dollar in market price. Cuba is in total blockade. They're losing power every day. Power meaning electricity. And a few days ago, they had total blackouts, and their operation is being affected. Iran is the same thing. Iran provides China with very cheap oil, and provides China with the fact that they cause instability in the Middle East, which forces the US to stay in the region even longer. So it's important to look at it from an international and grand strategy point of view. So coming back to the Gulf, I think we will see three dynamics coming out of this. Number one, US Gulf defense relationships will stay the same. The Gulf showed that they cannot be coerced out of its policies. Hosting US forces was a sovereign decision by Gulf states after the invasion of Kuwait. It wasn't something imposed on the Gulf. It was something the Gulf decided after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and the Gulf showed that it will not be bullied or coerced. We decide who we have defense relationships with. Nobody can tell us who to have defense relationships with and not. So that's one dynamic. Another dynamic, I see a Gulf Europe security, diplomacy, and trade nexus forming, because both the Gulf and Europe are advocates and beneficiaries for the norms-based international order, free trade, freedom of movement, avoiding wars. And because of this convergence of interest, I think later on we'll see more partnerships forming in that way. And I think this nexus can also include other nations and actors which are also beneficiaries of a norm-based international orders like ASEAN and major economies in East Asia, because currently they are feeling the heat. These economies, because of what's happening as the fracture in the global system, are feeling the heat. A third dynamic coming out of this, and this is very important, from a Gulf perspective, we have a dual threat scenario. We have an Iran that's willing to attack its neighbors very aggressively, targeting civilians, targeting trade, targeting its neighbors. And then we have an emboldened Israel. We shouldn't forget about Israel as a source of instability and threat. What's happening in the region now is ultimately the outcome of Israeli aggression since the 7th of October. The post 7th of October Israeli overreaction and genocide, overreach in seven Arab capitals and states. And because of that, it created this scenario where instability fuels instability fuels instability and led to this war. So the Gulf, post this conflict, would have to manage, this dual threat scenario, an emboldened Israel and a bloodied and unhinged Iran?
Yes, I think I got very interesting points from you, Mr. Rashid. I think the first one is that Iran's attack did not pressure the Gulf states, but in fact it backfired and even strengthened the policies that they have decided, which leads to how I think this is also a very key component to the issue is that they are reaching towards Europe that you mentioned, a nexus of that you nicely worded, a nexus of strategic and trade. Uh, my question is on that a little bit. Maybe does that signals like a move away from the US, or maybe less reliant on the US, maybe towards a more multi-polarity dynamic?
No, I would see that as diversifying with rather than diversifying against. Because of our partnership with the US, we were able to have, world-class air defense and general defense capabilities. So I think that would continue. The Europe angle is based on strategic interest. So the Europeans have more interest in Gulf stability now than the US, because we have to remember something. In 2013, the US became a net producer of oil and gas. In the past, that was not the case. So the strategic importance of Gulf states to the US has reduced. But I do believe defense ties will continue, especially when it comes to defense acquisitions, training, and interoperability, because the US defense products and capabilities have proven their worth. Yes, they're expensive. Yes, it comes with a very interesting partner. Yes, it's the operation cost is significantly higher than other defense defense sellers. But in this war, the US defense products and capabilities and technologies have proven its worth to protect these nations. We have a sort of a normal life here in the midst of a high intensity war, and I have to emphasize that this is a high intensity war. 200 ballistic missiles on a small country like Qatar is no joke. It's something serious. But even though we've been attacked to this extent, we do have a normal, alhamdulillah. Initially, we had to go into some emergency models of working from home, but now I'm here in the office. People are at school. My kids are at school. And it's all because of our, alhamdulillah, Gulf and Qatari defense planning and our partnerships with the US and with Europe. So it is diversifying with, not diversifying away.
Mhm. And also, I find it very interesting future that you said that it will also include potentially ASEAN countries and other countries that the Gulf have not used to work closely with. So I think before we move towards I think the final or the second final question, do you have anything to add before we go to the energy dimension, economic dimension?
Of course. So just let me emphasize on this concept, and this is a concept I'm exploring personally.
Mhm.
Is this non-US, non-China nexus?
Oh.
We are going into dynamics that are very close to the Cold War, even though people are calling it multipolarism. Unfortunately, the way I see it, it is soft bipolarism.
Soft bipolarism.
And this is, it's not like the US and the Soviet Union where they were peer competitors. You have a US, which is sort of the global hegemon, and then you have China, which is a potential peer competitor and not a peer competitor. Because China, from a military point of view, does not have very sufficient expeditionary capabilities. So China cannot move aircraft carriers into, what the US has done in the last 2 months, regardless of how we view it, from a technical point of view, has been very impressive. From no aircraft carriers in the region for the first time in 30 years they were able to move 2 aircraft carriers, bring capabilities into the region. Now we have a marine expeditionary unit also moving into the region that might cause potential ground operations. Not a full-fledged invasion, by the way. The number of forces are not sufficient for a Iraq-style 2003 invasion, but more akin to a very specific special operation, potentially somewhere in the coast or in the interior. China doesn't have that capability yet, maybe down the line. So that's why I call it soft bipolarism. States in the Gulf, in Europe, in ASEAN and East Asia, the advanced economies of East Asia, have a very big challenge, because potentially later on you will have to choose. Are you with this camp or that camp? This is not a problem today, even though policies of the Trump administration have expedited a lot of these dynamics by initiating a trade war with China, by forcing allies and partners to move away from Chinese technology. It's still not there. We're not at full bipolarism. So from a policy point of view, these states that benefit from open trade and from trading with everybody have to really work hard to deal with the restraints of the international, the post 1945 international order setup, which is the UN and the Security Council, which has proven very ineffective, and design something new to at least sustain some aspects of a norms-based international order. That's why I've included these states, because they're advanced economies, they rely on trade, and they're interconnected with the entire world.
Excellent, Mr. Rasyid. If you may, I would like to talk about the broader global dimension. The Gulf is not just a region. It is a cornerstone of global energy stability, which raises a critical point. Protecting infrastructure today in the Gulf is protecting the global economy, if I can say that. So as energy infrastructures becomes more central to geopolitical competition, how should we think about Qatar's role in safeguarding strategic assets while continuing to underpin wider regional and global stability?
Okay, like you mentioned, initially the crisis here in the Gulf is a crisis felt by everybody. You know, we have fuel prices increasing everywhere, but just to add an additional, analytical layer. So we have oil, which is used for fuel, and most of the oil in the Gulf goes to East Asia. We have gas, mostly in LNG exports, and mostly from Qatar and a little bit from the UAE and Oman. 20% of global LNG comes out of the Gulf. And this is purely used for electricity generation in most of Asia. So, Qatar sells to India, to Pakistan, to Bangladesh, to China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, in different percentages. Sometimes it reaches 40% in the case of Taiwan, and it can go as low as 15% in Japan, which is even still significant because Japan is such a big economy. So that's the LNG aspect. In addition to refined products like fuels, condensate, natural gas liquids. Another angle to look at it is the Gulf is an enabler for global food security. The Gulf produces 20 to 30% of fertilizer, through different types of fertilizer, but also the Gulf provides feed in the form of oil and condensate to countries like India to produce their own fertilizer. So we've done a little analysis, and we've asked, if this crisis continues and the Iranians keep harassing ships in the Strait of Hormuz, the food security of between 1.1 and 1.7 billion people is exposed because of the amount of fertilizer. So 1/7 of the global population. Another angle is to look at specialty gases like helium. Qatar exports between 30 and 40% of global helium. in the market. No other country produces this percentage. Helium goes into three areas: space, healthcare, and semiconductors. Space, it's used to cool, rocket motors, and which is important for the global economy, but it's not detrimental. But look at healthcare. Helium is used to operate MRI machines. And I think everybody in the world has faced or had a relative that unfortunately faced cancer. And we know how important MRI machines are in diagnosis. The price of helium that goes into MRI machines has went about double, twofold. The supply is very low. The demand is very high. Some hospitals in South Asia have started canceling their MRI appointments because they don't have enough helium to cool the magnets. So that's a health risk issue. Another angle is semiconductors. Helium is used for the production of silicon wafers and for memory chips. And most of the helium coming out of Qatar goes to Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, which are big producers of these memory chips and the silicon wafers. And talking to some industry experts in those regions, I used to work in LNG, so I still retain some of the contacts. And they say very soon they would have to issue force majeure notices to their buyers because they cannot produce the memory chips. And you can imagine this going into companies like Toshiba, Samsung, but also companies in China which buy chips from these producers. So it is a multifaceted structural disaster in the making when it comes to the economic angle. Of course, we hope, with the current Pakistani-led mediation, that we can get the Strait open and we have a ceasefire, because I'll go back to the political and strategic side a little bit. We should not underestimate the amount of damage that happened inside Iran. Iran has been off the internet for now 30 days. So we don't have a real sense of the amount of damage and destruction and humanitarian crisis happening inside Iran. We don't have a real sense. Some news agencies have offices in Tehran, but because there's no internet, we have no idea what's happening across the country. I think when the internet finally comes on, we would be in shock of just how much destruction happened. And this has a multifaceted risk. This can lead either to state collapse or can lead to a failed state. And we know in the region very well that these two options are both negative, and these states usually export instability. We saw it in Iraq after the US invasion, where because of the instability, we had terrorism and extremism pouring out of Iraq. Same thing in Syria, same thing in Lebanon. So post-conflict, even if they reach a mediated solution, I am worried that whatever comes out, Iran will still be a source of instability, either deliberately or indeliberately, because of the fact that it might be a failed state or a weak state. And a weak state in the Middle East is not good. And this pours down to the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes.
We don't know. So if there is state collapse in Iran, how could I guarantee that the other side will also respect global shipping norms? If there's a strong regime, I can negotiate with that strong regime.
Yeah.
If there is no regime, who am I negotiating with? So it's a very, very risky situation. And this is why I see there has to be an international effort to keep the strait open.
Yes, exactly. And as you mentioned, the global repercussions, it goes beyond energy. It also includes healthcare, food security, as you mentioned, and also semiconductor. And I think you also aptly elaborated on the political impact on how it will affect not just the region but the whole global dynamics. And I'm also with you that I hope that the situation has not exacerbated, that it will lead to a failed state in Iran as well. And I think it's such a sad situation that's been happening, especially previously we have been all these Muslim countries has been tied with the cultural and Islamic Brotherhood, but that's the I mean that's the complexity of the situation. So I think we are leading to our last question. Based on our short, but I think it's very substantial discussion. I think one thing that we could agree that it's a very complex situation. We have covered a lot of dimensions, very eye-opening dimensions. My last question is, I think you've touched a few of these, but maybe just the last question is, any refinements, any further refinements that Qatar and its Gulf neighbors could implement moving forward?
Of course. I just want to, touch on something that you mentioned. It's important to note that from a Gulf perspective, Iran has always been a source of insecurity, especially after the revolution, but even before that. Even when Iran was a kingdom, Gulf states always had, very, very, a lot of issues with Iran, because Iran is a big country, and they always want to exert their hegemonic tendencies. And because of the revolution, the GCC was formed. This is something very important. The GCC was not formed. It was formed initially as a security alliance to counter Iranian expansionism, because after the revolution in Iran has exported a lot of instability. Iranian-linked groups have tried to assassinate the Emir of Kuwait in the 1980s. There were many operations inside Saudi in the 1980s and inside Bahrain. Qatar, alhamdulillah, was spared because Qatar, the demographic ties with Iran and Qatar is much less than Bahrain for obvious reasons. But it was always a source of instability. We hoped after the Kuwait invasion for a grand reapproachment with Iran, and that was working. Qatar developed good ties, Oman, the Saudis eventually, the Emiratis were Iran's biggest trade partner. I think it's a shame that we see that all of these efforts in the last 30 years were thrown out of the window. But it comes back to this concept that I think it's important for us to focus. Some states prioritize regime security over development. And I think we see this dynamic in Iran, but also in Israel, especially with the current government. So both are regime preserving entities. And when you have a regime preserving entity, the grand national interest becomes secondary to regime survivability. So I think, and this links to your question, I think we need to work very hard to make sure that the actors in the region do not prioritize regime survivability over grand regional and national interests. Looking at grand revisions, I'll just maybe repeat some of the things I've already said of, the importance of a non-US, non-China nexus that can work with both the US and China to manage this great power competition, but also to try to preserve aspects of a norm-based international order. States like Qatar, a mediating state, a state that punches above its weight in many aspects, has an important role because we're bridging states. We bridge between the East and West, geographically and diplomatically. Even with the issues we have, with Iran, and the issues we have with the Israelis, and the issues we have with many other actors, we have always been a mediating state. And I think this is where Qatar can provide towards this new order. I think we should double down on our mediation efforts. Of course, we should revise and enhance our defense capabilities. Our defense capabilities proven extremely well. And like I said, it comes back to this historical criticism of Gulf states for overspending. The performance of Gulf states in this war, which I repeat is a high-intensity war, even though, alhamdulillah, we're able to retain a high level of normalcy in our lives, shows that even Muslim and Arab states can militarily perform very well, even though historically it was always, these states were always criticized for its poor performance. We see this in the Arab-Israeli conflict in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The Gulf states proven that Arab and Muslim armies can perform extremely well under high-intensity warfare. But what's coming next might be even more challenging. So we need to double down on our defense ties, develop sovereign defense capabilities, and Gulf states are already building up their own defense industry, especially Saudi, Qatar, and the Emirates. And I think this has to continue, but also enhancing our relationship, bilateral and multilateral, with like-minded states like Malaysia, ASEAN, Europe. And this requires a lot of effort. Historically, all of our relationships were managed by our relationship with the great powers. I think we should retain more agency and autonomy and look into developing these relationships outside the frameworks of the great powers.
Excellent. On that note, I think, Mr. Rasyid, thank you for your insights. It has been a pleasure having you talking here with us. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on Forum on the Go, FTG by IAIS Malaysia. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. Thank you.
Thank you. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum.